Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video, I'm finally getting around to doing a season ranking for a show I've been wanting to do for a while, and that show is The Circle. So with the 5th season of The Circle US ending that cycle of Circle seasons, I feel like it is the perfect time to finally stop down and rank every Circle season up to this point, including the international versions, where here we have 11 seasons of The Circle to rank. Obviously the 5 US seasons, but also including 4 seasons from the UK, which include the 3 main series ones and the celebrity version, plus also the Brazilian and French versions of the show as well. And with that, let's jump right into it. At number 11, the worst season of The Circle, in my eyes, ends up being The Circle UK Season 2. And this is a season that just never really clicked with me, which is kind of funny because this is actually the first season of the show I covered on the channel. But it's a season of the show that I just found myself kind of bored while watching, even when watching it live. I mean, there are some great characters on this season, particularly Tim Wilson is someone that really stands out as an all-time great character. But really outside that, I mean, you got Georgina, you got Sammy, and I guess Woody, but it's like, I don't know, the rest of the cast really just does not stick to my mind. I feel like the season just felt like it dragged unnecessarily for a while, where I feel like The Circle as a whole is a show that kind of struggles with its pacing, where I feel like Modern Circle on Netflix like kind of struggles in the fact that pacing is a bit too quick, while I feel like these seasons of The Circle in the UK kind of struggle with pacing being a bit too slow at points, and I feel like season 2 really exemplifies that to the umpteenth degree, where I just, again, found myself largely bored through a lot of its runtime. And while there are some pretty great characters here and there, I feel like Tim is really the only one that truly stands out above them all. And with the season also having a kind of lackluster outcome as well, I do feel like, for me, this ends up being the worst season of the show in my eyes. Now, number 10, moving on to a season that is another one that I believe there is this part of the fan base that does really enjoy this season. However, it's one that never really clicked with me either, and that is The Circle Brazil. Now, Brazil, I can understand why people would like this season. It is a season that has some pretty fluid dynamics. It's one where the power structure does shift a couple times across the season, where while you have like Dumaresque as the constant throughout a lot of the season as this big character and player, beyond that, everything else like shifts quite often, where we have someone like a JP who becomes a big player towards the back half of the game, but he starts off pretty slow until he's able to pick up all the outsiders and kind of takes over the game. We see these Catfish doing pretty well, where again, like a lot of the initial players go home early on this season. We have a really crazy outcome this season in Marina winning due to a very strategic vote, one of the few times in the history of Circle where pretty much everyone voted tactically at the end, which led to this really weird outcome. But again, those things are positives. However, it's another season that really just does not stick to my mind that well. I feel like it's a season that a lot of the cast does not come off as super memorable, especially like the earlier boots of the season. And while you do have this like great downfall for Lorraine and Akel, and again, JP's gameplay is something to be applauded on this season. Again, Dumaresque is a notable character. I do feel like as a whole, the season just never really clicked with me, and because of that, for me, it's here number 10. Now, number 9, we're finally moving to a US season of the show, and here we're starting that off with The Circle US Season 2, which, again, is another season that never really clicked with me. I mean, it's a season that I will say, as part of my lack of enjoyment for this season comes from the timing of the season, where, again, if you're just a Circle US watcher, you wouldn't really feel this, but I felt a lot of fatigue coming into this season, where this season ended up airing immediately after the Celebrity Circle UK, but also UK Series 3, which aired back to back, and this was immediately following that. So this was the 3rd season of The Circle I had watched pretty much over the course of a month, and again, that felt like really overboard, and through that, again, it did feel very repetitive to me. But even beyond that, I felt like this season was one that didn't really stand out as much as certain other seasons, where, I mean, yes, you do have some notable characters here, like Chloe is a big character, you have the Tara-Alicia Savannah feud, which is a major storyline early on. You get Jack or Emily, who has a fun role as a catfish on this season. But really outside that, the cast never really clicked with me. I mean, you got like Courtney and River, who are fine and have major presences on the season, but not really the most notable characters in the world. You have the winner in Delisa, who I feel like is one that gets kind of glorified over time, to where I really don't find her to be that interesting in TV, especially in comparison to figures from other seasons. And I also don't feel like she played particularly well. I feel like she's probably the worst player of the Circle US from a gameplay perspective. And again, just the overall fatigue I had of the series at this point just made me just not really love this season that much. So because of that, for me, it's here at number 9. Now, number 8, moving on to another US season, and this is season 1, which I will say I do have a level of nostalgia, if you will, for this season, where, I mean, this obviously, when it first aired, felt a bit new. Now, for me, it wasn't necessarily in the fact that I had just watched UK seasons 1 and 2 not too long before this season, but US season 1 here is obviously a very influential season. I feel like it's a season that brought The Circle to a more mainstream audience. I feel like it's a season that is probably the most, like, quote unquote iconic for The Circle, in the sense that I feel like most Circle fans know the people from this season pretty well, the likes of Shuby and Joey and Sammy, which I think those 3 in particular are really standout characters here. And I feel like overall, just the overall concept of The Circle is something that felt very fresh and new when this aired. And I feel like those things really stick to my mind. However, I will say that upon further inspection, I do feel like this is a season that probably hasn't aged particularly well, in the fact that it's one that, in comparison to future seasons, there's not as much drama going on here, with this really being mostly a love fest of this group that started off the game and survives the first few rounds, really sticking together and just continuously taking out the outsiders, which can just get kind of boring from pure gameplay front. And again, like, I think there are standout characters here that really elevate this season beyond this boring steamroll that you would expect it to be, though again, in comparison to future seasons, I don't think it's good enough to quite match up to those, and because of that, for me, it's here number 8. Now, number 7, we're moving on to a season that, this one is a bit of a shakeup based on how I've talked about the season in the past, where this and the season we'll talk about immediately after it used to be switched when I've talked about them in the past. However, at this point, at number 7, I do have the Celebrity Circle UK. And this is obviously a very different season of the Circle. It's much shorter. Obviously, it being a charity season that was aired over the course of a week, being a much smaller scaled season of their show, but it was a fun one for what it was. Again, despite it being a smaller version, I feel like you got this interesting dynamic for the show, kind of showing you how, like, an all-star season of the show would be approached, and how you approach the Circle when people know who you are, where we had these quote-unquote celebrities catfishing as other celebrities, and considering how connected these celebrities were and how certain people would know these other people, I feel like that brought a very interesting dynamic to the show here. However, at the end of the day, it is still a very small scaled season. It's still a season that I think at the end of the day did not stick to my mind that well. Now, we do get a fantastic outcome to the season. Again, another one of these situations where a person ends up winning due to a very tactical vote. And just the fact that Lady LeSure, who is probably one of the worst Circle players I've seen, ends up winning the season is just really funny. But outside of that, not a season that has stuck to my mind. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it is a much shorter season. But because of that, for me, it lands here at number 7. Now, number 6, moving on to season that, again, I used to have below Celebrity Circle. Now it's above it. We have Circle UK Series 3. And again, this is a pretty solid season of The Circle. I think it's a very average season of The Circle in my eyes, where it's certainly not bad, and there certainly are good moments here and there, but never really excels to be a truly elite season. Now, I do think a lot of the season revolves around Manrika, who is an incredible character, great casting, and while there are certain frustrating moments with her and how she doesn't really own her game, I feel like it's still very interesting. I feel like she's still very interesting to watch. But even beyond that, we had interesting dynamics from the likes of Andy trying to run the game and people starting to suspect him of being strategic. We get Gemma being this fun catfish that gets called out. We get Saeed, who brought a decent amount of entertainment to the show. We got the whole blue tally, orange tally storyline early on. We got Felix, who ends up being an interesting winner here. And I think their dynamic with Manrika definitely led to a lot of entertainment. So again, like, there are some notable storylines here. However, I just feel like overall the season doesn't really reach the peaks that certain other seasons did. And because of that, for me, it's here number 6. Now, number 5, and here we're going on a string of US seasons, starting it off with the Circle US Season 4. And this is just a very solid season of The Circle. Again, this is a point in the show where I do feel like the show got very formulaic. I feel like The Circle US has kind of become pretty stagnant in recent seasons, with it really just repeating the same style of twist over and over again, has the exact same format and overall structure to its seasons. And again, this didn't really change that. I mean, we get this week 1 twist this season being the Spice Girls, that again, they were fine on this season, had a fun energy, though really at the end of the day just felt like straight up stunt casting. And along with that, we also get stunt casting in week 2 with the introduction of Delisa's husband. So here we do also get some decent strategy in the fact that it does feel like people started to finally pick up on the game a bit. We do have some alliances formed between Bru and Alyssa and Yu Ling, while also Yu Ling being also connected to Frank and Rachel, and this all culminates in that safety chain game that leads to Alyssa's elimination, which was a great moment. Also, just in general, Yu Ling and Frank were incredible characters from this season. I think 2 real big standouts from this season, with Frank as a winner being a very satisfying outcome for the season. Probably being the best Circle winner we've had up to this point from a pure gameplay perspective. Also, him just being a genuinely really likable person. And while this season did overall feel very formulaic, I did feel like as a whole the casting was very strong, which is what leaves it here at number 5. Now, number 4, moving on to the most recent season of the show, we're moving on to Circle US Season 5. And again, this just felt like more of the same. This is essentially just the Circle Season 4, but slightly better in my eyes. Again, I think the cast is around the same level of quality, where I think you have these likable figures like Chaz, Raven, Sam, but also we do get a good chunk of strategy. I mean, we get the likes of Jennifer really playing the game strategically, and we have this alliance between Jennifer and Tom. We have alliances formed between Chaz, Sam, and Raven, along with Jennifer. We get the return of Shuby, and while he's a complete disaster here, he does try to play the game strategically and form a rebellion, and that's fun. But again, at the end of the day, this also just feels extremely formulaic. Again, filled with twists that we've largely just seen already. Again, the return of the hacker twist. We get the eliminated players coming back to play as a character together. Again, we get this stunt casting and the casting of Shuby. It's like, again, it just feels like a formula we've seen before. Because again, it makes us feel very repetitive. But again, I feel like it's an elevation of Season 5, where it feels like a more strategic season. The cast, I would say, is probably just slightly better. Though I think we also get a really fun outcome here in the Sam win being a pretty satisfying one for the season, the one that isn't entirely predictable in the way that Frank's win was. So again, I think as a whole, Season 5 for me is a slight elevation of Season 4, and because that's here at number 4. Now, number 3, we're moving on to what is already the top US season on the board, a season that I've actually kind of dropped on my rankings since it aired, and that ends up being the Circle US Season 3. And this is a season that I remember at the time that it aired, I thought this was the definitive best season of The Circle. And I still stand by that it's obviously a very good season of The Circle. I think it is the most strategic season of The Circle that we've seen so far. I think it's really the only season of The Circle where we've had these 2 well-defined strategic alliances form and them going after each other. And I think that's a very interesting dynamic to see in The Circle, of it being this actual strategic game. I think beyond that, we do get some great casting choices here. Again, I think you got the likes of James and Kay, who are fun characters. You get the likes of Nick, who is, again, up there as one of the best players the Circle has ever seen, being this very strong strategic player that was able to get together all the outsiders and form this strong alliance. We also had some other interesting storylines with the fall of Calvin being this fun downfall. We get other notable figures like Daniel and Roxana, and overall, I feel like this is a season that has this elevated level of strategy, but also has a solid cast to boot. However, I will say that in comparison to my top 2 seasons, I do feel like just something feels a bit missing when looking at it in retrospect. Now, I don't know if it's the fact that like week 1 feels like a bit of a slow point for a season, where again, we have the return of the blue and orange twist that we saw in the UK version, and again, like, it very much does feel like it just copying twists from the UK version that we've seen already, and that can be a bit underwhelming. And I think this time it doesn't work out as well as it did with Tally, where with Michelle you just kind of feel bad for her. And beyond that, you also have these like not as notable catfish in Isabella and Ashley and Jackson end up taking control of the game, and that's kind of underwhelming as well, though I still had a lot of fun this season at the time that aired, and I do think it's still the most strategic season of The Circle, especially from the entirety of the cast, and that leaves it here at number 3. Now, number 2, the second best season of The Circle up to this point, in my eyes, ends up being another of the more strategic seasons on the board, and that is The Circle France. And The Circle France is a season that I absolutely adored when I watched it. Again, when I watched this one too, I thought this was the definitive best season of The Circle. And again, it is a very strong one. And again, it is a very strategic one where we do see this alliance form early on between Romain, Alea, and Maxime that ends up really running the show. And in a way, you can look at it as a steamroll, though I do think they run into some complications along the way with having to pick up some of the outsiders at points to join them, and we see this opposition eventually forming to go against them. And again, I do feel like there's a lot of intrigue on this season, kind of being this first glimpse of how interesting of a strategy game The Circle could potentially be. But again, it also has a great cast to boot. I think Romain is probably one of the best casting choices The Circle has had. Again, being in line with some of the more likable winners in the history of the show. Again, Maxime being this very Napoleon-like strategic player is this interesting dynamic to see on The Circle as well. We also get other interesting storylines here, like the fall of Cedric, where I thought he was a pretty fun character. We got Ines, who is this pretty likable underdog figure. We had Nalia as these twin brothers who played a catfish and were these very confrontational figures. And again, just overall, I feel like this is a season that brought some drama to the table, but also had a good amount of strategy. It has a very well-defined storyline throughout it that I thought was very enjoyable. So because of that, for me, it's here number 2. And now number 1, the best season of The Circle in my eyes at this point. I think especially after having watched through the history of the show, at number 1, I do have the first season of The Circle ever, that being The Circle UK Series 1, which, I mean, at the time that I originally watched the season, I absolutely adored this season. I thought it was great. However, as time went on, obviously, it's like you see new seasons, you think that they're better than this, but I think now, having watched so many of the same type of season over and over again, especially with these Netflix versions of the seasons, I feel like it really brings me back and kind of seeing the strategy of the show not really evolve in any way, and the overall format of the show not evolve in any way. It makes me really appreciate the original season of the show, where to me UK Series 1 was such a great introduction to the show, being this true test of the show's format, of these people interacting without actually being able to see each other, and seeing the effects of people catfishing and seeing what interesting dynamics those bring. And to me, I really feel like UK Series 1 here really exemplifies all the pros that The Circle had when it started, that again kind of feel a bit stale by this point, but I do think this is a point where seeing this catfish hunting was actually interesting to the show. I feel like there's also just really fun characters on this season. I feel like this is a season that, despite it having this longer UK format, it never dragged for me, unlike Series 2 or 3. Like, this is a season where I feel like almost everyone brought something to the table. And while there definitely were aspects of the format that I don't think aged particularly well, and I do think they definitely improved for the better moving forward, I still do feel like this is a season that just feels fresh. Or again, we get some great casting choices here. I mean, like, even of the earlier boots, I thought Aiden and Mitchell brought some fun to the show. You get these big confrontational figures who come in later, like Hannah and Ryan and Precious and Scotty, who has a big role in the season. And then we get the finalists, who are all really great, all of them being fantastic characters. And we get Sean, who's really likable. We get Freddie, who is just really insane character on this season. Then we obviously get the Dan and Kate dynamic, kind of being this perfect catfish storyline for the show. And it leads to probably still the greatest moment in the history of the show, when the Dan and Kate meet up, where just the shock on Dan's face is still probably the best visual in the history of the show. But even beyond that, again, Dan himself was a fun character, being a mostly likable presence. But even beyond that, us seeing this catfish storyline continuing to unfold with him, and then also Alex brought an interesting dynamic to the show, and him having to play as this catfish and having to navigate through the game because of that. And also we get this pretty crazy outcome to the season, where it really just first shows us how crazy the circle format can be, where Alex, or Kate, despite being in a seemingly bad position coming into the final, ends up winning the season due to a more strategic vote at the end, which really shows you the issues with the circle format, but also just shows you how interesting the circle format can be. Really, just overall, I just feel like this season is just such a notable season in my eyes. It being my most watched season of the circle at this point, where this is the only season I've watched more than twice, and it has some of the most memorable moments for me and memorable characters for me from the history of the show, and because that for me, it is here at number 1. But there we go. That is my season ranking for the circle. Now again, I'll be back with more circle videos if we get more circle seasons at some point down the road. But obviously beyond that, just expect more of the similar style of content from this channel. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.